Okay, so get this. We're diving into a chapter called, like, American Energy and Science Dominance.
Wow, very dramatic.
It is, right. And it's from this whole report titled Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise. And apparently it's all about what a future conservative presidential administration might, try to do.
Interesting.
Yeah, big changes in energy policy, science funding, everything.
I see. Well, the way this chapter frames things is really fascinating.
Okay, how so?
Well, they basically say that America's energy and science sectors are in a full-blown crisis.
Oh, come on, really?
Yeah, and guess what they blame?
I don't know, budget cuts?
Nope. Extreme green policies.
Wait, hold on.
Mhm.
So, like, investing in renewable energy, pushing companies to be more, environmentally and socially responsible.
hmm
That's the problem.
That's what they're saying. They claim all that stuff is creating artificial energy scarcity, making the grid unreliable, and sending energy prices through the roof.
I see.
And it gets even crazier.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah, they say the Department of Energy, the DOE, is sitting on almost $900 billion in environmental liabilities.
$900 billion.
Yeah, basically, you and me, we're all on the hook for nearly $1 trillion in cleanup costs.
Well, so much for my dream of buying that private island, huh? But seriously, that's a massive number.
It is.
So if things are really this dire, what's their big solution?
Well, they call for a complete overhaul.
A complete over.
Yeah, they want to ditch what they call, quote unquote, green policies and just embrace this, like, all of the above energy approach.
Interesting.
And get this, they even suggest repealing some major legislation like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA,
Right, the IHA.
and the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, all because they include, funding for renewable energy.
Okay, so it sounds like they want to just rip up the rule book and start over.
Kinda, yeah.
What does that even look like in practice? I mean, how does that actually work?
Well, basically, they want to unleash the power of the private sector and, like, get the government out of the way.
Okay, so less regulation, more free market.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
I see.
Individuals and businesses, they get to choose their own energy sources without interference.
That's a pretty big shift in perspective.
It is.
Okay, so less regulation, more free market, got it.
Uh-huh.
But how does that solve that trillion-dollar cleanup bill we're apparently stuck with?
Well, that's where their proposal for restructuring the DOE comes in.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they want to rename it.
Rename the Department of Energy?
To the Department of Energy Security and Advanced Science.
And I'm guessing that acronym is going to be DSAS.
Exactly, DSAS. And they want to completely refocus its mission.
New name, new mission.
It's a full rebrand.
So what exactly would this DSAS do differently? What's on their to-do list?
Well, they envision it focusing on 5 core missions, like leading and coordinating energy security,
Okay, that makes sense.
promoting U.S. energy interests abroad,
Interesting.
pushing for advancements in science, obviously,
Yeah.
cleaning up those nuclear material sites.
Right, the $900 billion problem.
Yeah, and then, of course, developing nuclear weapons and naval reactors.
Okay, so energy security, science, and, oh yeah, nukes. Got it.
Uh-huh.
But what's wrong with the DOE as it is now? How do they justify such a drastic overhaul?
Well, they claim the DOE is just wasting billions of taxpayer dollars by subsidizing renewable energy, which they say distorts the market
Okay.
and makes America less energy secure.
So they see DFAS as a way to, like, streamline the department's efforts
Exactly. Cut the waste, get rid of the stuff they don't like.
and focus on what they consider to be the most important areas.
Precisely.
Interesting. So it sounds like they're saying the government is playing favorites in the energy sector.
Yeah, picking winners and losers.
And they want to level the playing field.
Uh-huh. Let the market decide.
I see, but wouldn't that also mean rolling back support for industries they like?
Oh, good question.
Like oil and gas.
Yeah, they talk a lot about ending the war on oil and natural gas.
That's right.
But they don't really get into what that means for existing subsidies or tax breaks for those industries.
Okay, so there might be some selective deregulation going on here.
Possibly.
But let's get back to this DSAS thing for a minute.
Sure.
How do they think this new department will actually achieve energy dominance? What's the plan?
Well, they have a whole bunch of ideas.
Like what?
Some of them pretty radical.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
They want to eliminate several offices entirely, like the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management,
No.
the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, a few others.
Okay, so those are gone.
Yep. And get this, they want to restart the licensing process for the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository.
Yucca Mountain. Are they serious?
Apparently. They argue it's a scientifically sound and safe location for storing nuclear waste.
Well, that's definitely going to stir up some controversy.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
Okay, so what else?
They also want to end what they call climate reparations.
Climate reparations. What's that?
Basically, financial aid to help developing countries deal with climate change.
So they want to stop helping other countries with climate change.
They frame it as, fiscal responsibility, saying American taxpayer dollars should be spent on domestic priorities.
Right, America first.
Uh-huh. And they also suggest that some of these international climate agreements are unfair to the U.S.,
Okay.
could hurt American businesses.
So it's a combination of economic and, I guess you could say, nationalistic arguments.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, that's interesting.
It is.
But what about all that environmental cleanup they were talking about? That $900 billion liability.
They claim a focused 10-year program could clean up most DOE sites.
10 years.
Yeah, and they say it could save taxpayers $500 billion.
$500 billion in savings. That sounds either incredibly ambitious or wildly optimistic.
Hard to say without seeing the details.
Right.
They don't really provide specifics.
Well, that's a big claim for sure.
Uh-huh.
So what else is on the agenda?
They also talk about expanding operations in Alaska.
Alaska. What for?
They want to expand the Arctic Energy Office, AE,
You're right.
to protect energy and national security interests up there, including stuff like rare earth minerals.
So more oil drilling in Alaska,
Well, they frame it as, energy independence and national security.
of course.
But yeah, it's about accessing those critical minerals, too.
Right. The ones we usually get from China.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a strategic move,
Definitely.
reducing our dependence on other countries for those resources.
Uh-huh. Making America more self-sufficient.
Okay, so they've definitely given us a lot to think about.
They have.
We've got their vision for reshaping the DOE,
Uh-huh.
their arguments for greater energy independence.
Right.
But what about the other half of the equation, science dominance?
Oh, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
They basically want to revitalize American science, reclaim our place as a global leader in research and innovation.
I love a good comeback story.
Right. So they argue that America's scientific leadership is under threat from, adversaries like China.
China, huh?
Yep. They say China's pouring resources into research and development, engaging in scientific espionage.
Espionage. Sounds like we're in a spy movie now.
Right. They point to instances of Chinese researchers stealing intellectual property from American universities, companies.
Oh,
And they're worried about China recruiting top scientific talent from around the world.
so they see China as a serious rival
Almost an enemy.
in the race for scientific breakthroughs.
Exactly. And they say America needs to get a lot more assertive.
Assertive.
Yeah, protecting our scientific assets, promoting our own research and development.
Okay, so a more aggressive approach.
Uh-huh. Makes sense, given their whole national security focus.
Right.
So to achieve this science dominance, they have a whole list of recommendations. Refocusing the national labs, streamlining science agencies, holding them more accountable, and making sure the economic benefits of all this research flow back to the American people.
Okay, so invest in science, protect it, make sure it benefits the country.
Yep, that's the idea.
That's a pretty big agenda.
It is, and it'll be fascinating to see how they think it'll all work.
Well, this is shaping up to be quite a journey.
It is.
Through the world of energy and science policy, we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot more to uncover.
And I have a feeling it's going to get even more interesting.
I think you're right.
All right, so we've seen how this chapter wants to shake up the whole Department of Energy, but they don't just stop there.
Oh, no.
They dive deep into, specific offices and programs within the DOE.
They really get into the weeds.
Yeah, and they've got a whole laundry list of recommendations.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even begin with all this?
Well, one that really stands out is their take on the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. Yep, CSER, they're the ones responsible for, protecting our energy infrastructure from attacks and disasters.
Right, cyber attacks, physical attacks, natural disasters, the whole shebang.
Exactly. So what do they want to do with CSER?
Yeah, what's their big idea?
Well, they actually want to elevate it to, an assistant secretary level within the DOE.
Wow, a promotion.
Basically, yeah, giving it more authority and resources.
So beefing up security.
Makes sense, right. They see this as absolutely crucial.
Yeah, especially with all these concerns about attacks and vulnerabilities.
Uh-huh. But they're also really keen on eliminating a bunch of programs within the DOE.
Oh, yeah, the ones they call special interest funding programs.
Right. Anything that smells like the government picking winners and losers in the energy sector.
So what kind of programs are we talking about here?
Anything that supports the commercialization and deployment of specific energy technologies.
Okay, so the government shouldn't be involved in that.
That's their argument. They say those activities should be left to the private sector.
Interesting.
Government subsidies, they argue, just distort the market and undermine energy reliability.
So it's all about free market competition, letting the best ideas win.
That's the idea, no government meddling.
But isn't there a risk that some important technologies might get left behind if they don't get that initial support from the government?
Yeah, that's a valid point. They do acknowledge that there might be a role for government in supporting basic research.
Okay, so some research is okay.
But when it comes to actually bringing those technologies to market,
Yeah.
they draw a hard line. That's strictly for the private sector.
Interesting. So it's a delicate balance
It is.
between, supporting innovation but avoiding market distortion.
Exact.
Now, I noticed they also talk about streamlining the approval process for things like LNG exports.
Yep, that's on their list.
And they also want to reform how the government manages its own energy use, right?
They want to reform the Federal Energy Management Program. Yes, FEMP, so that it focuses solely on ensuring, reliable and cost-effective energy for government buildings and operations.
So less emphasis on being green.
Well, they argue that FEM has become too focused on those green energy solutions.
Which they see as more expensive or less reliable.
That they're all about keeping the lights on and the costs down.
Okay, but doesn't that risk leaving the government behind when it comes to sustainability? I mean, shouldn't the government be setting a good example?
That's a good question. They don't really address that potential criticism.
Right.
They really seem to prioritize cost-effectiveness and reliability above all else.
When it comes to government energy use.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Okay, now let's talk about FRRC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Oh boy, they have a lot to say about FRC.
This seems to be a major target for their reform efforts.
It is. They basically want to redefine FRRC's entire purpose.
Really? How so?
They say FRRC should only focus on ensuring affordable and reliable energy, and that they should completely ditch any authority related to climate change.
Wait, so they want to strip FERC of its ability to consider climate change?
That's what they're saying. It's a pretty controversial idea.
It is. I mean, isn't that kind of like telling a doctor to ignore a patient's heart condition?
It's a pretty bold move.
It is.
But their argument is that FERC's only job is to guarantee reliable energy at just and reasonable rates.
Okay.
Not to pursue, broader social or environmental goals.
So those issues should be handled by someone else.
That's their thinking, yeah. Either through legislation or other agencies.
Okay, so they're drawing a very clear line in the sand.
FERC's job is to keep the lights on and the prices down, period.
But doesn't that seem kind of short-sighted, given the potential impact of climate change on our energy systems?
Like, what do you mean?
Well, what happens if, extreme weather events disrupt the grid or rising sea levels flood power plants?
Right, yeah, those are valid concerns.
They are.
But the chapter doesn't really get into those long-term risks. They're definitely focused on the here and now.
Okay, so immediate concerns over long-term risks.
That seems to be their priority.
All right, got it. Now, what about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC?
Oh, yeah, they don't hold back when it comes to the NRC either.
What's their issue with them?
They basically accuse the NRC of being way too cautious, too risk-averse.
Well, isn't nuclear energy, notoriously complex and potentially dangerous?
It is.
Surely some level of regulation is necessary, right?
They agree. They acknowledge the need for safety regulations.
Oh.
But they think the NRC goes way too far.
Too far.
Yeah, they say all this focus on hypothetical worst-case scenarios just drives up costs.
And slows down the development of new nuclear technologies.
Exactly. They want to streamline the approval process.
Make it easier to build new nuclear plants. But isn't that a gamble? I mean, what if something goes wrong?
Well, they argue that the risks are manageable and that the benefits of nuclear energy outweigh the potential downsides.
Clean energy, energy security.
Yep. They believe advanced nuclear technologies are the way to go.
So they're big fans of nuclear power.
They are.
Okay, so we've talked about CSER, FERC, and the NRC. But they also want to restructure several other key offices within the DOE, like the Office of Nuclear Energy, the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management,
DCM,
and the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy.
Yeah.
Why don't we take those one by one?
Sure. Sounds good.
Let's start with NE, the Office of Nuclear Energy. What don't they like about this one?
Well, they say NE has too much influence over the business decisions of commercial nuclear energy firms.
Okay.
They think NE's involvement creates an unfair bias towards nuclear energy and distorts the market.
I see.
So they want to reduce NE's role and let the free market decide the fate of nuclear energy.
But wouldn't that also mean cutting back on research and development funding for new nuclear technologies?
It's possible they don't really go into detail about how NE's budget would be affected, but they definitely want to see a more hands-off approach from the government.
When it comes to promoting nuclear energy.
Yeah, they think the private sector can handle it.
All right, so less government involvement, more private sector leadership.
Yeah.
Got it.
Uh,
Now, what about the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, FECM?
oh, this one's interesting.
I have a feeling this one's going to be controversial.
It is. They actually recommend eliminating it altogether.
Eliminating the entire office. That's a pretty big move.
Yeah, it's a bold statement.
So why do they want to get rid of it?
They argue that the office has just strayed too far from its original purpose,
Which was?
improving fossil fuel production.
Okay.
They say it's become too focused on carbon capture and storage technologies.
Carbon capture. They don't like that.
Nope, they see it as a distraction from achieving energy dominance.
But isn't carbon capture one of the few ways we could potentially keep using fossil fuels while reducing emissions?
They're not convinced. They're skeptical of its effectiveness and affordability. They think it's a waste of time and money.
Okay.
They'd rather focus on expanding domestic oil and gas production.
So, a classic free market argument.
Yep, let the market decide.
But what about the environmental implications of just scrapping this office?
It's a good point. They don't spend much time discussing those potential impacts.
Okay.
Their focus is really on energy production and economic growth.
All right, so those are their priorities.
Uh-huh.
Now let's move on to the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EAR.
Ah, yes, EAR, another one they're not too fond of.
What's their problem with EAR?
They basically see it as, like, a symbol of everything they dislike about current energy policy.
Oh, really? Like what?
Too much government intervention,
Okay.
too much focus on climate change,
Right.
and not enough emphasis on traditional energy sources.
So they're not fans of renewable energy?
Nope, they think EAR has become too focused on pushing a green agenda.
At the expense of affordability and reliability.
Exactly. They're especially critical of EAR's efforts to decarbonize different sectors of the economy.
Like transportation, buildings, agriculture.
Yep. They believe those efforts are misguided and harmful to consumers.
But isn't reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, essential for addressing climate change?
That's the argument. Yeah.
And don't those efforts often lead to innovations that actually benefit consumers in the long run?
Like what?
Well, more fuel-efficient cars, more energy-efficient appliances, things like that.
They acknowledge that there might be some benefits,
Okay.
but they think those benefits are overstated.
And that the costs outweigh the gains.
That's their view, yeah.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about the role of government in shaping energy choices.
Uh-huh. And promoting innovation.
Okay, so they want to reform these offices.
Yeah.
But they also want to get rid of several others completely, right?
That's right. They recommend eliminating the Grid Deployment Office,
Okay.
the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations,
Yeah.
the Loan Program Office, and even ARPAE,
ARP, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy.
the one and only.
That's a lot of offices on the chopping block.
It is quite a list.
ARPA especially has been really successful,
In what way?
supporting some pretty groundbreaking research in energy technology.
Interesting.
So why would they want to eliminate it?
Well, they argue that these offices are duplicative
Okay.
and that their functions could be handled by other agencies or by the private sector.
So it's about saving money and streamlining things.
That's their reasoning.
But isn't there a risk that we could lose some valuable research and development efforts if these offices disappear?
It's possible, but they seem to have a lot of faith in the private sector.
To pick up the slack.
Yep. They think the private sector can drive innovation in the energy sector.
Okay, so it's a gamble, but one they're willing to take.
They're definitely not afraid to shake things up.
No, they're not.
And we're not even done yet. They have a lot more to say about FERC and the NRC
Oh, yeah.
and their vision for achieving American science dominance.
It's a pretty fascinating, if somewhat controversial, roadmap for the future. They've definitely given us a lot to think about.
They have.
We've covered their vision for reshaping the DOE, but now I want to see how they think all this will actually impact the energy landscape.
That's the big question, right? How does this vision translate into reality?
All right, so we've really dug into their plans for overhauling the Department of Energy. Slashing offices, Yucca Mountain, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, pretty radical stuff.
But now I kind of want to zoom out a bit
Okay.
and see how they think this all fits into the big picture of American energy dominance.
The grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumps out at me is this emphasis on shifting power away from the federal government
Interesting.
and giving more control to individual states.
States' rights.
Yeah, exactly. They argue that states can handle their own energy needs and resources better than the feds.
I see.
They specifically mention FERC and how it handles those regional transmission organizations, the RTOs.
Right, RT.
They say states should be able to decide whether or not to join an RTO without being forced by the federal government.
So more autonomy for states.
Yeah, basically. And just to remind everyone,
Sure.
RTOs are those big regional organizations that manage the flow of electricity across multiple states.
Right, keeping the lights on, coordinating energy markets.
Exactly. So the chapter is basically suggesting that states could just go it alone, manage their own grids and energy markets.
It's a bold idea.
It is, but wouldn't that risk creating like a patchwork of regulations?
Potentially.
And maybe even make the grid less reliable overall.
Yeah, those are valid concerns.
They are.
But their argument is that states are more accountable to their citizens,
Okay.
and they can tailor their energy policies to local needs better than the feds.
So more flexibility for states,
Uh-huh.
but also potentially more fragmentation.
It's a trade-off for sure.
It is. All right. But what about FERC's role in things like electric transmission and natural gas pipelines?
Those are big ones.
Those are crucial for moving energy across state lines.
Right, so what do they say about that?
Well, they argue that FERC should basically take a hands-off approach. Just make sure that the planning and approval processes for these projects are, resource neutral.
Meaning?
They don't favor any particular energy source.
So no special treatment for renewables or fossil fuels, just a level playing field.
That's the idea. But how would they prevent companies from building transmission lines that, mainly benefit their own interests?
Right, even if it means higher costs for consumers.
Exactly, that's my concern.
Well, they do say that FERC should protect consumers from unfair costs.
Okay, that's good.
They're especially worried about situations where the costs for these projects are socialized.
Socialized.
Yeah, spread out among all ratepayers, even if only a small group benefits.
Okay, so the people who benefit should be the ones paying.
That's their thinking.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But they also seem really skeptical of how FERC currently considers environmental impacts.
Especially climate change.
Yeah, climate change, they basically say FERC should just ignore it.
Stick to their core mission of affordable and reliable energy.
And avoid using their authority to advance what they call, quote, vague societal benefits, end quote.
Like addressing climate change.
Exactly. But wouldn't ignoring climate change actually make it harder to achieve affordable and reliable energy in the long run?
How so?
Well, what if extreme weather events, damage power lines or rising sea levels, flood natural gas pipelines?
Right, those are legitimate concerns.
They are.
But the chapter doesn't really address those potential risks.
It seems like they're kind of operating under the assumption that climate change either isn't a serious threat or that we can just deal with its impacts without changing our energy policy.
That's a good observation.
Okay, so a bit of a blind spot maybe, but let's move on to natural gas pipelines, another hot-button issue. They seem pretty set on making it easier to approve those.
Absolutely. They want FERC to streamline the approval process.
And avoid considering things like greenhouse gas emissions when evaluating those projects.
So full speed ahead on natural gas, climate implications be damned.
Basically, but doesn't that kind of contradict their whole thing about letting states decide?
What do you mean?
Well, what if a state doesn't want a pipeline running through its backyard?
Right, that's a good point.
They acknowledge that states have a role to play,
Okay.
but they also argue that FERC's authority to cite interstate pipelines trumps state-level concerns.
So national energy needs over local opposition.
Basically, yeah, states' rights only go so far in their view.
Interesting.
And it doesn't stop at pipelines. They also want to boost exports of liquefied natural gas.
LNG.
LNG, right? They see that as a key part of American energy dominance.
Makes sense.
They want FERC to fast-track approval for LNG export facilities.
And not let environmental concerns hold things up.
Exactly. They're all about maximizing American energy production.
And using it as a tool on the world stage.
Right. Supporting allies, countering rivals like Russia.
It's a pretty America-first approach.
It is, but It does seem to put us at odds with global efforts to move away from fossil fuels.
It definitely creates some tension.
For sure. But this chapter isn't just about energy, it's about science too.
Right. American science dominance.
They're pretty worried about China.
They see China as a major competitor, almost an enemy, in the race for scientific breakthroughs.
And they're not just worried about fair competition, they're concerned about espionage, right?
Absolutely. They claim that China is actively stealing intellectual property from American universities and companies.
Wow, that's serious.
They see it as a direct threat to American economic and national security,
So it's kind of like a new Cold War.
with science and technology as the battleground.
Exactly. So how do they propose to counter this threat from China? What's their plan for achieving science dominance?
Well, they have a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, lay it on me.
First, they want to refocus the national labs,
Okay.
get them back to basics, prioritizing fundamental and advanced science.
So pure science, no commercial applications.
That's the idea. They think commercialization should be left to the private sector.
So the government funds the basic research and then just hopes that it leads to, useful inventions and innovations.
Basically, yeah, a trickle-down theory of science.
Interesting. But they also want to streamline the government's science agencies, right?
Yep, consolidate them, make them more efficient.
Less bureaucracy, more centralized control.
That's the idea.
But wouldn't that risk stifling creativity and innovation? I mean, science often thrives on, independent thinking and experimentation.
It's a valid point, but they seem to have more faith in centralized planning than in the, messy, unpredictable nature of scientific discovery.
Right. So a more top-down approach to science.
And they also want to increase accountability,
More oversight.
making sure the national labs and other agencies are answerable to the Secretary of Energy and Congress.
So more transparency, making sure taxpayer dollars are being used wisely.
Exactly, aligning research efforts with national priorities.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't all this oversight also create more bureaucracy and slow down research?
Yeah.
I mean, scientists often complain about having to spend way too much time on paperwork and administrative tasks.
That's a fair point, but they don't really get into those potential downsides.
Okay,
They're definitely prioritizing control over flexibility.
I see. But they also talk about making sure that, the economic benefits of all this research actually flow back to the American people.
Right, making sure those investments in science pay off for the country.
Exactly. But how do you actually measure that? I mean, it often takes years, even decades, for scientific discoveries to turn into real-world products and technologies.
It's tricky for sure. They don't provide any easy answers,
Okay.
but they do stress the need for greater transparency.
More openness about what's happening in the labs.
And more collaboration with the private sector to commercialize promising technologies.
So more teamwork, more focus on turning science into tangible economic benefits.
That's the goal.
It's a pretty ambitious vision, but also a bit vague on the specifics.
That's true. They lay out a broad framework, but they don't always get into the nitty-gritty of how these changes would actually work.
Well, they've definitely given us a lot to think about.
They have.
This chapter offers a really interesting glimpse into a certain worldview.
A very particular perspective.
Yeah, one that emphasizes American strength, free markets, and a limited role for government.
It's a vision that will definitely appeal to some and raise concerns for others.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this is just one perspective.
One potential path forward.
There are many other viewpoints out there.
And many other solutions.
It's up to each of us to, engage with these ideas critically.
And form our own conclusions.
Well said. This deep dive has been a wild ride through energy policy, science funding, geopolitics, the whole shebang.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have bold claims, controversial proposals, thought-provoking questions.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It has, and while this chapter doesn't give us all the answers,
It definitely doesn't.
it does offer a valuable starting point for a deeper conversation about the challenges and opportunities facing American energy and science in the 21st century.
It's a reminder that these issues are complex, multifaceted. There are no easy solutions.
Right, but by talking about these things, exploring different perspectives, staying informed.
We can all contribute to shaping a better future for everyone.
Exactly. It's a collective effort.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it informative and engaging.
We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, keep asking questions, share your own thoughts.
Because ultimately, the best solutions will come from all of us working together.